G'day, Matthew Pallett here again today, and today I'm planning on discussing you the topic of what's the difference between good architecture and bad. As I've stated before, that art in general needs to be designed with purpose and skill, and architecture shouldn't be any different, but unfortunately it is. So, why do I say this? Well, that's because while architecture definitely comes under the broader spectrum of art in general, it does have certain unique qualities that place it quite distinctly different from the rest of art. This is why I've decided to define the difference between what I determine as good architecture and bad. Now, but before we can do this, we really do need to ascertain what is the actual purpose of architecture. And this is where I find people have the greatest problem, because they tend to look at architecture in a finite area rather than the broader spectrum of where it was originally designed. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, architecture in my mind needs to satisfy 5 points. Firstly, is it fit for purpose? If you're building a building designed for, let's say, disabled people, and you fail to put in an adequate ramp, well then it's really not fit for purpose. Secondly, is it understood? Now I'll break this up into 2 subcategories. The first one being people that have actually studied architecture, and the second category, people that haven't. If it is not understood, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it definitely helps. Thirdly, does it make you think? One of my pet hates is a boring building. Fourth, does it make good use of the space? And finally, number 5, can it last? What's the point of building something then to turn around and then have to tear it down? Now, I really don't care what happens from point 2 onwards. If it can't then do what it's intended to do, then in my mind it's automatically bad, regardless of what type of structure it is. Whether it's a private dwelling or convention centre, office block, or even a monument for that matter. Now in my mind this cannot be negotiated. If it can't do this, then effectively it's a bad piece of architecture. From my mind, all other points can be negotiated. Now, having point 1 out of the way, let's turn around and move on to point number 2. I feel that this is the most difficult point to achieve and is the most closely related to art in general. This is the reason why I've broken it up into 2 subcategories. As in art in general, if your peers do not get it, then you really turn around and have to ask yourself, well, what am I doing wrong? Now, this, as a consolation prize, at least you would satisfy point 3, as in it gets people to think. Now, the second category is probably where the most discussion is held, and in reality, the same can be said for art in general. However, I find that with architecture, this is amplified. Now, I find there are 2 reasons why I say this. Firstly, that it is more architecture in general is more accessible than, say, art. Well, at least the outside is. It's always on public display and it's big. If you were to design or to paint a 3-story painting, people would talk about it regardless of all other aspects. The second reason why I find is that people treat architecture differently to art. When it comes to art, people don't necessarily say that they need to understand it, whereas with architecture, they say that it needs to be understood and therefore is held to a higher standard. Now, personally, I don't buy into that. I don't like that. I feel that there are plenty of things out there in the world that are very good that people don't understand. However, this is the most common talked about component, so I feel that it should be noted. Now, point number 3. Does it make you think? And personally, I feel that this is probably one of the best ways to ascertain whether a piece of architecture is good or not. Once we've got fit for purpose out of the way, does it make you think, in my mind, is very important. Otherwise, it's just functional. And now there's nothing wrong with a building being just functional. After all, that was the original purpose and the reason why we created buildings. But in my mind, architecture needs to be set aside differently from something that is just merely functional. As in art in general, good architecture really should leave you with feelings of inspiration and appreciation. And so architecture really shouldn't be any different in this regard. Now, point number 4. does it make good use of the space? Something can be functional, but not necessarily good use of the space. Well, what do I mean? Well, let's say for argument's sake I was to build and design a surf centre for a surf club. I could have all the necessary components in that surf club that was to work, but then turn around and place it somewhere far away from the beach. Well, then it's really not a good use of space. You'd be better off designing that building with some other purpose in mind. Conversely, let's say we were to look at the convention centre, or in Melbourne, or what's colloquially known as Jeff's Shed. If you were to go inside that building, what they've done inside that building is phenomenal with their use of space. And if I was to ever get permission to go inside and film inside, I would dearly love to show you what's in there. It's truly inspirational. So then we come to the final point, can it last? When I was thinking of this, it reminded me of the Eiffel Tower. Now, one thing you need to realise about the Eiffel Tower is that along with another building, was originally intended to be a temporary structure. But after it was built, it had such success that they decided to keep it. Had it not been built and designed as well as it was, then regardless of how successful it was, it would have had to have been torn down. And it is something that I plan to talk about in a future post because it is quite remarkable. So I hope this goes some way to describing what is a good piece of architecture or not. Now remember though, along with other forms of art, architecture is about a feeling rather than about hard facts. So that's why I talk about architecture as having a soul. So in conclusion, I feel that architecture, along with art in general, tends to be subjective. So when someone says that something is a bad piece of architecture, you really do need to probe a little bit deeper and as to why they say that. Now, if they can't give a good reason, take note of what they have to say, but then go away and form your own impressions as to what actually is a good piece of architecture. Thank you.